Let's jump straight into this fascinating and honestly pretty controversial source document by author Vivify Mariposa. We're totally re-examining the legacy of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Now, instead of getting caught up in what Roosevelt intended to do or the grand things he said he wanted for America, this piece insists we look strictly at the raw actions he took and the permanent machinery he left behind. It's a deep, sideways look at historical economics, executive power, and modern politics.
To kick things off, get a load of this quote, because it absolutely shatters what we usually expect to hear. In 1939, Henry Morgenthau, who was literally FDR's own Treasury Secretary, openly confessed that 6 years into the New Deal, unemployment was totally unchanged and the national debt was just exploding. The author uses this shocking inside admission to frame their whole argument. The New Deal wasn't some miraculous cure. According to this text, it was a failed machine, basically a temporary bandaid that permanently rewired the American government.
So here is our roadmap for unpacking this document. First, we'll look at the FDR myth. Then we'll step back to the American system, unpack the Band-Aid legacy, trace some echoes in the present, and finally look at reversing the machine. Let's get to it. All right, Section 1. The FDR myth and defending the machine. Before even getting to the history, the author points out something really interesting about modern knowledge institutions. Even the AI models we use every single day are apparently programmed to reflexively defend FDR. The author claims that if you run this historical critique through modern AI, the systems immediately push back. It's like they treat the mainstream historical consensus as untouchable truth before they even look at the critical data. The source basically groups the standard FDR defenses into two main buckets. You've got the textbook version, the hero who saved America from the Depression. Then there's the sophisticated version, the secret anti-imperialist whose plans were sabotaged after he died. But guess what? The author completely tosses out both of these versions. Why? Because both of them demand that we judge FDR on his good intentions rather than the actual, tangible, on-the-ground legacy of his actions. Moving right along to Section 2, the American system and what was lost. To really grasp what the author claims FDR dismantled, we have to look at what was there before the 1930s. The document describes an older era, built up by leaders like Abraham Lincoln and William McKinley. They called it the American system, and it was all about prioritizing domestic production and total national independence above everything else. If we walk through the timeline, the author argues the real economic wound didn't actually happen with the stock market crash in 1929. Nope, it happened in 1913. We go from the rock-solid stability of the Gold Standard Act in 1900 to McKinley's assassination, which shook up political power, straight to the birth of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The source claims it was actually the Federal Reserve's easy money policies that artificially pumped up the Roaring '20s, which then triggered the massive 1929 crash that FDR inherited when he took office in 1933. The text draws this incredibly stark contrast between these two worlds. The McKinley-era American system was built on protective tariffs, sound money, and building up things internally. On the flip side, what the author calls the FDR machine pivoted the entire country toward a managed currency, massive central banking control, and hooking America directly into global finance. It's a complete 180-degree shift from internal protection to global management.
Okay, Section 3, the Band-Aid legacy, installing the machine. Here's where we look at the specific actions FDR took. The author makes the case that Roosevelt's policies were never really meant to just be temporary relief for a struggling nation. Instead, they were a very deliberate, permanent transformation of how the American government interacts with its citizens.
And the perfect example is hidden right here in this number, $14.33. In 1933, just days into his presidency, FDR signed an executive order literally forcing Americans to hand over their gold to the government for $20.67 an ounce. But wait, immediately after that, the government revalued that very same gold to $35 an ounce. So the government basically pocketed a $14.33 profit per ounce from its own citizens, and if you didn't comply, you faced prison. The author notes this move completely shattered the old monetary anchor and fully funded the new regime. Then there's the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Picture this. During the Great Depression, while millions of Americans are literally starving and out of work, the government paid farmers to destroy their own crops and slaughter their livestock. The goal? To manufacture scarcity and artificially drive up food prices. The author points out this massive, glaring irony. While they were paying American farmers to produce less, the government was simultaneously importing millions of pounds of foreign wheat, corn, and cotton. This beautifully illustrates the four main pillars of what the author calls FDR's permanent dependency architecture. First,
Social Security introduced a forced payroll tax, essentially stopping citizens from building private wealth they could pass down. Second, when the Supreme Court actually ruled his actions unconstitutional, FDR tried to bypass them by packing the court with 6 new justices. Third, the administration played massive word games, deliberately redefining words like freedom to mean government provision rather than individual liberty. And finally, the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act stripped Congress of its constitutional authority over tariffs and handed that immense trade power directly to the executive branch.
Let's transition over to Section 4, Echoes in the Present. The machine keeps running. Honestly, one of the most fascinating parts of this entire document is how it connects the legal mechanisms set up way back in the 1930s to massive events happening right now in the 21st century.
For instance, the author draws a direct one-to-one parallel between FDR's 1942 executive order that interned 120,000 Japanese Americans and the 2020 pandemic lockdowns. Now, obviously the target populations were vastly different, but the author argues the underlying legal mechanism was identical. The government declares a state of emergency, suspends constitutional rights, restricts movement, destroys livelihoods, and enforces all of this through legal threats. The source claims this master key of emergency power was forged by FDR and simply dusted off in 2020.
Following that same thread of government overreach, the text brings up MK-Ultra, the CIA's infamous 1950s mind control program. It was exposed back in the 70s, but the author points out something super surprising. A brand new House Oversight Task Force hearing on MK-Ultra is scheduled for May 2026. By looking at this timeline, the author is basically asking us, why over 70 years after it began is the government suddenly revisiting this extreme example of unchecked federal power?
To wrap up this section, the author claims these 6 specific patterns: using endless emergency powers, paying farmers not to farm, printing fiat money as the go-to crisis response, pressuring the media to control information, bypassing Congress with executive orders, and fusing corporate monopolies with government power were all completely normalized under FDR. And the argument here is that they remain fully active today, basically running as the invisible operating system of the country, all without direct voter approval.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Reversing the Machine, the Return of the American System. The author shifts the analytical lens to right now, arguing that recent political movements, specifically those under the MAGA umbrella, are actually engaged in a deliberate, structural dismantling of FDR's 90-year-old machinery.
The author points to this massive wave of foreign capital as proof that this reversal is actually happening. We're talking trillions of dollars from Japan, Saudi Arabia, India, South Korea, and the UAE flowing straight into U.S. manufacturing, auto, steel, and energy. The text energetically argues this is definitely not charity. It's proof that new protective tariff leverage is successfully shifting the global math, driving capital and production right back onto American soil, which is exactly how the old McKinley system used to work.
So we're looking at a clash of 2 entirely different philosophies. FDR's legacy is framed around government retirement dependency, open-ended defense contracts that actually pay contractors more when they spend more, and the U.S. acting as the steward of global finance. In stark contrast, the author points to modern reversals, things like the proposed Trump IRA pushing workers toward private inheritable wealth, mandates demanding fixed price accountability for government contractors, and an overall push to restore industrial sovereignty over global management.
Just to put the sheer scale of this reform into perspective, $120 billion. That's with a B. According to the source material, that is the staggering amount of guaranteed reimbursement consulting contracts the federal government handed out in fiscal year 2024 alone. The author notes that recent executive orders are finally starting to audit and restrict these blank checks, demanding fixed prices and ending what they call a 90-year gravy train for the contractor class.
And we can see how the international community is reacting to this shift. The author highlights this quote from Lord Robertson at London's prestigious Chatham House, who openly worries that America's time as the global steward might be over. The text interprets this as deep international anxiety. Basically, these global institutions are terrified because the United States seems no longer willing to sacrifice its own working class and industrial base just to fund and police their global systems.
Before we wrap up, the author asks us to chew on one incredible historical contradiction. History books and politicians absolutely love to build grand monuments to FDR, painting him as a national savior. But immediately after his presidency, the country rushed to pass the 22nd Amendment. As the author so perfectly puts it, it's a warning dressed up as a law, expressly written to ensure that no single president could ever again accumulate that much executive power.
And that leaves us with this final, provocative thought to consider. The authors laid out a really powerful case by mapping out actions rather than just intentions. So what do you think? Are we witnessing the deliberate rebuilding of the sovereign, production-focused American system? Or, when you look around at our institutions today, are we still living inside the permanent machine that FDR left running? It's a fascinating question that completely reframes how we look at American history. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and keep asking the big questions.